In video games, we all love to play as our favorite athlete and our favorite team, right? That's why we play Madden, FIFA, NBA 2K, and other sport video games. These video games give us a chance to play out fun little trade scenarios, recruit brand new teams, and relive some of our favorite sports moments for our teams. The one place that we haven't been able to do that, and as a Temple fan I'd love to be able to pretend that we're good somewhere, is in the NCAA video game realm. Sports fans have spent way too long waiting for a proper NCAA football or basketball video game. It's a darn shame that if you want to play a game as your favorite college football team, you either have to buy an old NCAA video game for Xbox 360 or PlayStation 3, or you either have to pretend you're playing as your own team using Madden. The Xbox and the PS3 option will run you back a couple $100, which obviously isn't for everybody. The other option, to pretend, isn't that fun either. If so many people want to play these NCAA video games, and they do because the price for a video game has skyrocketed since the beginning of the pandemic, why hasn't there been one made since 2013? Today we're going to answer that question, as well as the future of the NCAA video game franchises, and why the NCAA has fought against these games being produced for so long. Now, the NCAA calls its athletic participants student athletes. This was a term invented by Walter Byers, the first NCAA president, to fight against collegiate athletes who claimed that they deserved workers' compensation or other rights granted to employees in a normal job. The term student athlete was embedded into nearly all of the NCAA's rules and regulations to prevent any ambiguity in the NCAA's position on the subject. The NCAA unequivocally says that student athletes are not employees and thus do not deserve compensation or benefits granted to employees. This is going to be really important later. The workers' compensation rule came into play in the 1950s when a widow sued the NCAA for workers' comp rights on behalf of her husband, who had died as a result of injuries suffered during a football game. The Colorado Supreme Court, which is where the case took place, ruled in favor of the NCAA, saying that colleges were not in the football business. The NCAA didn't need to pay a single dime to the widow. Now, the NCAA is clearly in the football business, and the case had lasting effects on the NCAA's legal defense of their current practice, which includes not allowing athletes to be compensated for anything besides the cost of attending college. The NCAA has claimed time and again that student athletes are amateurs, and amateurs don't get paid. Employees do. Student athletes are not employees according to the NCAA. Now, because of this rule, NCAA athletes are not allowed to receive real monetary compensation for their services. They are theoretically compensated with a college education and high-quality training facilities to hone their athletic skills, but outside of that, the NCAA doesn't allow students to make money via endorsements or any other type of monetary compensation. If an NCAA athlete were to ever receive free meals or other perks that aren't offered to every other student at the university, they or their school might receive a punishment from the NCAA. It depends on the degree of the NCAA rule violation, of course, but student athletes receiving compensation is on the NCAA's list of big no-nos. That's why you see lots of schools being hit with fines or postseason bans because they violated these rules and allowed their players to get compensated more than they were allowed. Since compensation isn't allowed, there's no way for NCAA athletes to sell their own merchandise, sell their own autograph, or most importantly for our discussion, make money off of video games that use their names, their faces, and their styles. Which means that if an NCAA video game were to be produced, these athletes wouldn't be able to make any money off of being included in the game. That's highly irregular and inappropriate, as every other video game and every other sport video game requires that players give consent and be compensated for the use of their name, their image, and their likeness in the game. That's why Bill Belichick never appears in Madden. He didn't give EA Sports consent to use his name or his face in the contents of the game. Now, if the NCAA isn't allowing people to be paid to be in these video games, then they shouldn't be making these games at all, right? Well, that's exactly what former UCLA basketball player Ed O'Bannon said in a court case against the NCAA and the NCAA Sport video game franchise in 2015. O'Bannon's image and his likeness were used in an NCAA basketball game without his consent. The game had his height, his weight, his shooting hand, and a playable character that just looked just like him, but the game makers conveniently omitted his name so that you wouldn't know that it was exactly Ed O'Bannon. He realized that he wasn't getting paid anything for his presence in this game, even though he wasn't a player at the time that the game was released. So he sued the NCAA and the group that allowed his likeness to be used in the game. Several other players joined the lawsuit, including Oscar Robertson and Bill Russell. EA Sports was named as a co-defendant alongside the NCAA, since they were the ones that had made the game. Shortly after the suit had been filed, EA Sports stopped making NCAA video games altogether. EA Sports settled out of court, agreeing to pay millions of dollars into a pool that would be given and spread amongst athletes that deserve compensation for appearing in their football and basketball video games. The NCAA lost the case and was ordered by the judge to allow schools to offer cost of attendance scholarships, which included cost of living expenses and other things that are not explicitly covered under their tuition. Regardless of whatever the NCAA had to do, though, the message was clear. No more NCAA video games for the time being. And that's the way it stayed since 2014. We haven't seen a new NCAA video game cover athlete since Denard Robinson. So what's it going to take to get another one of these NCAA video games? A step in the right direction came recently when the NCAA decided to allow students to be compensated for the usage of their name, images, and likenesses, but only in certain capacities. Basically, athletes would be allowed to make money as a social media influencer would, leveraging their online following to generate some extra cash on the side. But they wouldn't be allowed to use school logos or names alongside that. The NCAA's decision was a huge step in the right direction because that's a lot of money that athletes can now tap into, but not allowing athletes to use their school's name and logo prohibits all but the most popular athletes from really making any actual money. This decision is still not nearly enough to get the okay for a video game on its own, though. For one thing, there would still be no schools in a video game on its own, though. For one thing, there would still be no schools and no logos in this video game. And as we know from the O'Bannon case, you can't just stick the players out on the field and make it look like the athletes are paying for a certain school. Everything has to be legally accepted, from the stadium, to the players, to the logos, and even the cheerleaders on the sideline. The only way that can happen is if the NCAA expands this ruling to allow for players to use their school's trademarks in advertising, and in endorsements, and in video games. The other issue that we run into with creating a new video game is that in order to get the rights to each and every player's name, image, and likeness, EA Sports and other video game companies either have to reach out to every single player that they plan on using, which isn't ideal in sports with over 100 teams and thousands of players, or these companies can get the rights from a group that negotiates on behalf of many athletes. This is really what's called group licensing. For professional sport leagues, EA Sports would generally look group licensing. For professional sport leagues, EA Sports would generally look to players' unions, like the NFLPA or the MLBPA, to do group licensing negotiations. Those unions negotiate a cut of the money for every athlete, popular or not. No such union currently exists on behalf of NCAA athletes across the country because there are so many of them and because no video games are being made for this sort of thing. That doesn't mean it can't currently be done, though. If whole conferences or a whole region of the country can negotiate with EA Sports, it can make things a whole lot simpler. However EA Sports and NCAA athletes decide to do it, any attempt by the NCAA to quash a video game based on issues with group rights and group licensing is just another way to suppress earnings for athletes. So in order to get a video game made, we need an expansion on the NCAA rules and a larger negotiating body to help players get their fair cut of video game earnings. Neither are impossible to get. But if we ever want to compete against other players with Trevor Lawrence under center for our team, EA Sports and the NCAA need to sort out their differences, or we're going to have to wait until Trevor Lawrence gets drafted into the NFL to do so. I hope you enjoyed this video on NCAA video games and athlete rights. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Leave a comment below on what you enjoyed from the video as well as something you might want to see in the next video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Highly Technical Sports.